perhaps it'd be appropriate, Mr. Wilde, to start with your work at Columbia, as we're sitting here near Columbia and in Columbia, in fact. I know you didn't start there, though, did you? You started at... I can remember seeing you in Warner's in a picture called High Sierra.
You're absolutely right. I came out here for my first time in Hollywood with Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh in Larry's production of Romeo and Juliet. I played Tybalt. And it was, at that point, the high point in my career, because I was working as a very hungry actor in New York. And I went to Lee Strasberg's actor studio, which I really think turned me into an actor. Until then, I was floundering in one dramatic school after another, plus working and whatever. So we had to rehearse out here because Vivien was still working in a movie, and they were finishing up the remainder of her part. And that was a great thrill, too. I mean, they paid all expenses out here. And at that time, of course, there was no real air traffic out here. We arrived by train, and my heart sank. Downtown L.A., the train station is in the middle of this really ugly, crummy, dirty industrial area. And there were, a ring of tall palm trees around the station, and everything else was hideous. But the next day they took me out to see Larry at his rented house in Bel Air, and my opinion changed. And I love it here, I really do. Anyway, Warner Brothers financed the production, and I was signed out of the rehearsals for a contract. And it was a very good contract. They talked to me about my being a new, young, leading man, the real actor type, a taller John Garfield, somebody said. And I was getting $350 a week, which, translated in today's terms, was a very good contract for first time out. I didn't know what the studios were like out here. MGM was actors' heaven. Those who were under contract were very, very well treated. They had something to say, the stars, about what they wanted to do and didn't want to do. At Warner Brothers and Columbia, there was no such thing. If you were being paid, you worked, and they didn't give a damn whether you had already made your mark, if you had played a lead, if there was a role you could play or they thought you could be shoved into while you were being paid your weekly salary, you played that role, or you were on suspension. Now, I came out here on partly borrowed money because I had only one suit and one pair of shoes and a soggy overcoat, and that was it. So I didn't expect to be put on layoff in the first 26 weeks of this option contract. And they had me do, I had done a screen test in addition for Paramount, and they had a year before, and they had not wanted me. And now, having been signed out of the play, I thought, well, if they've seen me, I don't have to do another or test for them for any reason, but they wanted another test. I found out later why. They were doing High Sierra, the picture with Bogart, and they had no part that was really right for me at the time. And there was the part of a hotel clerk who blows the whistle on Bogart. And they knew from my background in theater that I spoke several languages and could do accents. So they asked me to do a test. One was a straight scene, a good dramatic scene. So they'd have some film to show their producers. I understood that. Then they wanted me to do this scene with a Mexican hotel clerk. I'm an American, and well-spoken, but with a Mexican accent, from the High Sierra screenplay. And I said, well, why? I'd never play that. Well, just to show your facility and this and that and the other. So I did it, and 3 days later, they called me, Cornel, terrific. Mark Hellinger, the producer, just thought you were great in it, and he wants you for the picture. And I said, well, I don't want to do that little part. Well, you know, you're on salary, you're on contract, and this and that, you have to do it. You know, we don't want to suspend you, so on. So I did the part. Unlike many people, I found Bogart to be a very boorish, unpleasant man who was either drinking or hungover in the times that I saw him, several times really, through the years, and very unpleasant to me as a new young player. I was thrilled to meet him, and you know, went up to say how do you do, and said how happy I was to be working with him. Yeah, okay. And I mean, there was no acknowledgement of me as a person at all. Anyway, that was done, and then they, again, didn't have something that was really great for me or good. So I played one of the leads with Arthur Kennedy in a picture called, I think, Right to the Heart, a very stupid B picture about prize fighting. Nonsense. And they still didn't have anything, so they put me into a film called Lady with Red Hair, which I played 3 lines. The only good that it did me was that the director, I can't think of his name now, an Austrian, very nice man, after a bit of rehearsal, took me aside and said, you're not a bit player. You're a very good actor. You don't just say your lines, you're always playing. What is your background? I told him, he said, why do they put you into this little thing? So they told me I was on salary and I had to do it. Well, at Christmas time, they dropped me. And, of course, I was crushed because I had to buy a car. And I was sending money home to my parents. My father was very ill. And I had an absolutely worthless agent, at least worthless to me, a man named Hallam Cooley, who represented my New York agent. I had never met him before I came out here. And he did nothing. Fortunately, one of the publicity people I met on ICR, a man named Jerry Asher, a very, very nice, good human being, advised me that I should change agents and suggested that he would introduce me to Nat Goldstone, who had a very powerful agency. They handled Betty Grable and a lot of big people. And his brother, Charlie, who worked for him, went to meet them, and I mean, with no fuss at all, like 30 seconds or a minute and 30 seconds, Nat said, fine, we'll sign you. And then Charlie talked to me at length about various things. And now, am I getting off the subject? Because I wonder whether
I was going to ask, actually.
You want to know more about the studios, really?
Well, no, it's a question I can't quite figure. I know you signed with Warner's. It was Warner's who dropped you, wasn't it?
Yes.
Now, I know you, Harry Cohn sort of must have come and said, you know, for a song to remember, but there's also some Fox pictures in
That's
here.
right.
Now, I can't quite remember who you were under contract to at this particular time.
For 6 months, I was nowhere. I was turned down for every reason you can think of. I did scene after scene, and always I had things very wrong with me. The color of my skin, I was too yellow, I was too menacing, and I don't know, everything. And finally, I went to 20th and made a test there, and took into account all the things that I had been turned down for and tried to avoid them. I knew that for my own satisfaction, I had to do a really good acting scene, and another scene that would prevent anybody from saying that I was menacing, threatening, yellow, or whatever. And I took a scene from The White Steed by Paul Vincent Carroll, which I played an Irish school teacher who is convinced by the daughter of somebody else in the school, I think, who the daughter is quite militant. And after several drinks together, she gets rid of my fear and inhibitions, and we start hurling coffee cups and plates into the fireplace and shouting against the establishment, which prevented any free thought and so on. So it was a very good scene. And then for the second, let's say, safety scene, I wrote myself a scene about a young man who stops a girl in a park and starts to talk to her. She threatens to call the police, and he's very diffident and, hopeful like a puppy, and finally remembers that he had seen her in the elevator in the same high-rise building where he works, and then they know both know this and that person, and next thing they're off to lunch, and they find out all about each other, So on the basis of those two, I got a contract at 20th. And to show you how people thought about Hollywood at the time, Luella Parsons, of course, was the big pundit of the papers. And she could kill you or make you sometimes. And she wrote, 20th showed her my test. They were very impressed with it, and I got a contract. And she wrote something about the best piece of film I've seen since Paul Muni first arrived on the screen or something. And I carried that clipping in my wallet for something like 4 or 5 years. And whenever I got low, I looked at it, and I thought, something, she must be right. Anyway, so that's how I landed at 20th. My contract came about as the basis of the screen test that I was telling you about. And even there, I ran into a problem. The man who was in charge of screen tests was a man named Bill Heath, and he didn't want to show Zanuck or the producers the scene from The White Steed because I was playing with an Irish brogue, and he thought that might throw them off, and even though I pointed out at the other scene without any accent. And I had to go to my agent, Nat Goldstone, to force him to show it to Zanuck. And then Luella saw it. And I began quite well there, but my career started in a very strange way at 20th. I got a call one day to rush right over to the studio. I rush over, and they sent me right to wardrobe. And I said, for what? And they said, we want you to try on all of John Shelton's wardrobe for a film which is supposed to start in 4 days, or 3 days or something. I was to replace him because he had the flu. Then he had a very bad case of it. So I went to wardrobe, and everything fit as if it had been tailored for me. So I got the part on the basis of my measurements. And it turned out to be a really a wonderful little picture to play in. It was a B+. It was called The Perfect Snob, and full of outstanding comedians of the time, Alan Mowbray, Charlotte Greenwood, and Charles Ruggles, and Lynn Barry and Anthony Quinn. Anthony Quinn played the heavy in it. And I had a marvelous time because I had a good comedy role, light comedy. It was kind of early Cary Grant kind of thing, and I loved it. I had a great time. And they were very, very pleased. So then others wanted me, and I did a horrible film called Is Manila Calling, which I didn't want to do, and I got in trouble for saying that it was a bad script because somebody asked me, the casting director, what do you think of the script? And I said, I think it's awful. He said, what? Well, I explained why, and he said, it's a hell of a part. And I said, well, it depends how you mean that. I think it's a stupid part because everything that I say is said by Lloyd Nolan. He's always saying, well, Jeff thinks this and that, and Jeff doesn't want to do this, and Jeff would this and Jeff would that, and Jeff never said anything. Anyhow, I got into trouble for that, too, and I had to explain why. I was knocking the script by the vice president, and I said, well, Mr. Schreiber, if somebody asks you a question out here, are you supposed to lie or are you supposed to answer truthfully? And, well, it's the truth, but, you don't want to hurt people's feelings. So I did the damn thing. I went on to better things. Actually, the pictures got bit by bit better and better, except for that one. And Life Begins at 8:30 with Ida Lupino, Monty Woolley, I played opposite Ida, and I enjoyed doing that very much. Irving Pitchell was the director. And then my agents told me that there was a wonderful role at Columbia in The Life of Chopin, a song to remember, which they felt I was very right for, which wasn't true because Chopin didn't look anything like me. Chopin was a, small, later consumptive man with a rather big, sharp nose and very, very thin face, very thin body. However, who cared about that? In Hollywood, they were looking for a romantic lead to play Chopin. Well, that was a very exciting possibility. Was taken over to see the casting director, who unfortunately was Max Arno, who had turned me down in New York as a possibility for a screen test in a very rude way. Not that I was the only one, that was the rule. You walk in a door, there are 150 actors waiting to see him. He was on a quick casting trip, and I couldn't figure why so many actors would go down the corridor and then stop as if shot and slump and walk away until I did the same. I got to this door, and there's a man standing behind a desk, and as I step 1 foot over the threshold, his hand is thrown up like Hitler, and a wave, dismissal. That's it. We never said hello, nothing. That was my interview. So here I was now up for this wonderful role at Columbia, and he was the casting director. He had been at Warner Brothers when I was under contract, had been fired there, and now here he was. Well, he didn't say so, but he remembered me. And I was absolutely wrong for the role. They had Larry Parks under contract, and they wanted Larry Parks to play it. They felt it would further his career. I understand all that. From their viewpoint, that was right, except that Larry had a fairly strong New York accent, and I don't think that would have been very good for Chopin. Anyway, my agents kept working on it, and Harry Cohn sided with Max Arno, and I had fenced a great deal. I fenced in college. I was on the intercollegiate championship team in foils. I was a national saber junior champ. I was on the Olympic saber squad. And so I started fencing here at the Hollywood Athletic Club. And one day, my agent brought over Charles Vidor, who was going to direct the film. And Charlie was a Hungarian, I'm 3/4, and I speak it. And we chatted a bit, and he said he'd like to come over and fence, and would I fence with him? And I said, of course. And so he came over regularly, then 2-3 times a week. And, it's like with tennis. You want to play with somebody who's much better than you and learn and so forth. So I fenced with him and helped him with some things. And one day he brought up the thing about the song to remember, that he thought I'd be very good for it. With my background in Olivier and all that. And he brought over the executive producer who also wrote the screenplay, Sidney Buckman, who was a marvelous guy, who was damaged very much by this un-American activities, Joe McCarthy crap. And both Vidor and Buckman wanted me for the part, and then this long battle began between them and Harry Cohn and Max Arno on the other side. And finally, they wanted me to do a screenplay, black and white. So I did the screenplay, and while I did it, Larry Parks sat on the side in the shadows and watched. Not very comfortable. And then he did a test. This was all, I think, part of either Harry Cohn or Arno's plotting. About 10, 12 days later, they asked me back to do another test in color. And Larry, again, watched while I did it, and he did it, I left. And at the end of that one, they were still not decided, so I had to make a third test of a different scene. And again, Larry was in the shadows, and finally came to a head, and I got the part. We were well into the picture by Christmas time. I went up to the annual Christmas party in Harry Cohn's offices. And, his office is a great big room, huge desk on the far end, so you can watch your knees wobble as you walk up or whatever. And went up there and I said, Mr. Cohn, Merry Christmas. He didn't say Merry Christmas to me. He said, a lot of people are knocking you, kid. I hope you can come through. Well, that drove me to have a few drinks at the party. So I went home and it really blew, wondering who was knocking me, all the people who were knocking me. Anyway, when the picture was released, it was an instant smash hit, and I was an instant star. It was out of a package. And Academy Awards came around, and I was nominated, which just thrilled me out of my head. And I went to the first preview at Pantages Theater in Hollywood and sat in the back with executives and whatnot. And God, the applause at the end of the picture, I mean, just marvelous. And then as we started for the lobby, I was suddenly mobbed. I couldn't move, and then I knew, that I was there. At Columbia, I made several pictures here because I'm sitting right in old Columbia Studios. But with Harry Cohn, you never knew whether you were his favorite that day or somebody he was going to put the blocks to. And it went back and forth. There was a period when I was constantly invited to his private projection room to sit with him while he made ugly comments about actors and the director and so on, and to his house for parties. And he was a marvelous host at his house. I mean, you couldn't ask for a more attentive and courteous man.
Did you like him?
Well, almost everybody liked Harry when he was in his up and be nice mood. He was very charming. And then, with very little reason at times, he would turn and become such a lousy son of a bitch bastard. I mean, awful. He did the dirtiest things to people. And sometimes would try to overcome that by then doing something very, very nice. And I went that whole routine with him over the years that I was under contract. Well, when I got the part, Columbia said, this is a marvelous star-making role, and we'd like half his contract. By then, I'd had a lot of trouble with Zanuck, and Zanuck, not a lot of trouble, but some trouble, because I kicked about scenes that were senseless, or I never understood why they couldn't correct it on paper. Because Zanuck said to me once when I pointed out something that made no sense at all, didn't jibe with what was on a previous scene, he said, if it doesn't play, we'll reshoot it. And I said, well, Mr. Zanuck, nobody's going to stand up in the audience and yell, it doesn't play, but they'll feel that it isn't right because it's contrary to what was in the other scene. He said, that doesn't matter. If they don't get it, we'll just, let it go, and if it bothers anybody, we'll reshoot. So he didn't like my answer, So on this one, he read the script and said, fine, I'll loan him out you can have him, half of his contract. And when the picture was finished and Harry Cohn showed it to him, his comment was, well, what the hell? All he does is play the piano in it. So anyway, at Academy Award time, I was doubly happy. So then I was split between the two, and they really worked my ass off. I tell you, we worked 6 days a week then for a long time. And we worked hours that were very different from today's hours, which were won over many strikes through the SAG. I was on one of the fact-finding committees, the first big strike. Anyway, you'd have a day that seemed literally endless, from the time you had to get up to get here to make up and spend, 45 minutes or so in makeup, and then hairdressing and wardrobe and on and on. So, you had to get up sometimes 5:30 and be working at the studio till maybe 8:30, 9:30, whatever it was at night. And one of the major contributors to the fatigue that people experienced then was the fact that there was no fast color film. And average exposure was like 1,500 candle power, because otherwise it wouldn't register well. I mean, now you get 200 ASA or whatever. It's marvelous today. So it was broiling hot on the set. I remember Fred McMurray, in one picture we did, Women's World, taking the temperature on the set, a dining room scene, a dinner scene, and it was 115 at the table. And when you went outdoors, they had not only the hot sun, and Leave Her to Heaven, for example, I was in Arizona for a lot of it, and then they had these enormous arc lights, which absolutely blinded you, in addition to the sun. There was nowhere to look. You could open your eyes. I mean, they'd start to tear in like 15, 20 seconds. Anyway, so that's how I got to be under contract to both. Finally, my agents got me a change of my 20th contract, so I only did one picture a year for them, and I was free the rest of the time, and then I began doing things independently. But Zanuck, I really didn't like Zanuck. In many ways, he was so cheap and gross, and the way he talked about women, the jokes, and the whole, I don't know, I respected his accomplishments, because you have to. He made some awfully good films, and he was a very good studio executive, but the so-called human side of him was not very prepossessing as far as I was concerned.
Can I take you on a little bit to The Greatest Show on
Sure.
Earth and ask you how that came about, how DeMille, for instance, sort of got roles for DeMille?
Well, I got The Greatest Show on Earth, again, because of a bit of luck. The part I played, the Great Sebastian, was that of a Frenchman, and DeMille had signed a French actor. And, of course, it was a very, very physical role, with all the trapeze work and climbing up ropes. And after 3 months, Betty Hutton was training with the trapeze, first an 8-foot ladder and then higher and higher. But the poor Frenchman, after 3 months, couldn't climb a rope without using his legs. And, as a circus performer, you put your legs out horizontally and go up the ladder, up the rope. So my agent, I changed agents finally after many, many years with the Goldstones, to Charles Feldman, famous artist company. And one of the men there who handled me for many things, Milton Pickman, who was a good friend of mine too, he heard about their having trouble over there and told DeMille about me, that I was in terrific shape, and of course DeMille knew who I was. And as I found out, I'd seen almost all my films, the bigger films, and took me over to see him. DeMille was sitting at his desk, not a big office. I'd say about the size of mine, or maybe a bit smaller. Jammed all over, every wall was jammed with things and photographs and whatever, and the outer office too, and there were 4 or 5 other people with him. Bernice, his secretary for many years, a very efficient and charming woman, and Henry Wilcoxon, who was his associate producer and a marvelous guy, and of course had starred as an actor in many films, and a couple of other people whom I didn't know. DeMille wore bifocals and metal rimmed, and In fact, they were just the little sort of half-moon glasses that, you know, he used for reading, and then he looked at me over them as if he were purchasing a horse, maybe. I wanted to make sure there's nothing wrong with the fetlocks or whatever. And he greeted me, you know, cordially, nicely, and said, "Are you in good shape?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Do you think you can climb up a rope without using your legs?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he got up and came over and started feeling my muscles. I was sure the next thing was going to be, you know, open your mouth, I'd like to see your teeth. But he left that one out and started off wearing his puttees at tremendous rate to one of the sound stages. And the whole entourage following. Bernice, poor woman, she must have carried 30 pounds of scripts because he always wanted every script, every page of every script that had been written, whenever he wanted it, right then, there. So she had to carry this enormous load. But we get to the stage, and I met Betty Hutton, and you know, she was up on the trapeze, which to me was 150 feet high. I always had acrophobia, fear of height. I really had no other phobias. I'm not afraid of things. Height bothered me. And there were all the circus trainers and whatever, and all this was on the soundstage. And DeMille asked for the rope to be let down, you know, the big fat ropes that are easy to hold. And I took off my jacket. He wanted me to climb up a rope without using my legs. So I did, and he was very, very pleased. And I got the part, and he said, "Of course, with you playing it, we'll have to change it to an American instead of a Frenchman." And I said, "Mr. DeMille, please don't do that. The part is so French in its character and its attitude in every way." And I said, "I speak French, and I can do all kinds of accents. I did in New York on radio, and I did a movie called Centennial Summer, in which I played a Frenchman." So he saw the movie and then very nicely called me up and said, the first time he heard an actor doing a French accent that sounded authentic, and I could play it with a French accent. And interesting thing about him, at that time, I was way up in the counting at 20th and Columbia, you know, with fan mail and stuff. I mean, tremendous numbers, like, maybe not today, but then it's like 10,000, 11,000 a month. And after Forever Amber, my salary at 20th went to $200,000 a year, which was one of the top salaries there. And here, this was 1951, I think, and DeMille offered me $50,000. I said to my agent, "No, I mean, this, not to me, it offered my agent." And I said, "Well, that's insane." "No, sir." And Jimmy Stewart was already cast, and Betty Hutton, and Heston was a new actor at that time, Dorothy Lamour, of course, and, you know, big people. And I said, I wouldn't take the 50. I'm playing one of the leads, and it's ridiculous. I said, I want this, whatever Jimmy's getting. And I just said 50. Every actor in the picture, any star who worked in a DeMille picture, got $50,000, because DeMille said, maybe correctly, that any actor who plays in a movie of his benefits so enormously by the success of the film that they should do it for nothing. So the $50,000 was a bonus, you know. Anyway, I wouldn't let the part go, so I played it, and I was very glad I did.
Was he easy to work with?
Yes and no. It's not like Harry Cohn, no, because DeMille was really a very gentlemanly kind of person. At times overly courtly, to the wrong people. I remember a publicity man bringing a girl on the set, a woman, from some Mideast fable they were shooting at Paramount, and introduced her as, from Egypt, and so on. And DeMille bowed and took her hand and said, "Any daughter of Egypt is honored here." That's one hell of a line. And as it turned out, the daughter of Egypt, this particular one, was kind of a sleazy broad who played bits in films. But that was typical. DeMille, right off, said to me, and I guess to the others, that he wanted me to come in as well prepared with my version of the part, with all the nuances and completeness of the role that I could come in with, because he didn't have much time for the actors. He had all the background to worry about. And that was absolutely true. Because whatever you were doing, an intimate love scene or whatever, and it worked for the circus background, there was always something, elephants hanging onto each other's tails going in the background, or, some kind of thing like that. And so that was great, because I was free to, interpret the role in the way I liked, and it was an awfully good, fun role to do. He discovered, however, that, of course, that I had fear of height. And I got a call from DeMille to come over and see him. And I said, well, I've never done it before. I didn't say I had fear of height. I just said that Betty had started on an 8-foot ladder, and here it is 35 feet up, and not used to it. And Henry Wilcoxon backed me up, and DeMille had the whole rig lowered. It cost them about $5,000. So, but the rig lowered, and then the circus trainer putting burlap bags on the net, which was a terrific idea, because then instead of seeing the floor 7 feet farther, you see the net with the bag, which is 7 feet closer. So I finally got started on the trapeze, and as soon as I got up there and actually had the trapeze, I felt better. I gained confidence then very quickly, and by the time we went to Sarasota, Florida, at the circus winter quarters to shoot and rehearse, I was okay up there. He'd take the net away time and again. He'd call up and ask if it was okay. Well, if I said, no, it's not okay, he still would have taken it away. So it was always okay. And it didn't really bother me. And we were, 40, 45 feet up for some things, and I never could have done that before the picture.
You're a very athletic actor, weren't you? Like, say, Burt Lancaster. You were always, physically in good shape.
Yeah.
You made that, I remember, we called it, I think, Fourth Musketeer or something over in Britain, but it was at Swords Point over here. Now, that was made at RKO. Now,
yeah, right.
When you made the picture at RKO, what was it like? Did you ever feel Howard Hughes around, or was he absolutely invisible? Or did you, He was invisible most of the time. I met Howard at Palm Springs before the picture. At the Racket Club, I was alone out there going through separation, divorce, and there was a blonde girl sitting at the bar, and I was having a drink farther down. I was contemplating going up and offering to buy her a drink, when in walks Howard. Now, I saw the girl there for like 40 minutes, sitting there all alone. And I was expecting a minute she's with somebody. And, finally I decided she wasn't, so I go and talk to her. At that point, Howard walks in wrinkled white pants and a wrinkled, not really clean shirt, and wrinkled and dirty tennis shoes. And this girl had this one drink all that time that she's playing with. And he goes up to her and says, "Boozing it up already?" You know, she really sipped that one drink. And then he saw me, and we just sat low a minute or so, and then off he went. Then, not too much later, I got a call from my agent that Howard wanted me to do this film. And I had director approval. And they kept sending me a list of directors, and I checked those I liked. And the list kept coming back. He wanted one particular director on that list of 10. And I kept turning him down. I didn't think he was right for that kind of, fast-paced action thing. And finally, my agent came to me and said, Cornel, Howard wants this man. Would you please do him a favor? Those are his words, and accept the man. And I said, well, all right. I'll accept the man, provided it's understood that I don't think he's right, and I'm only doing it because Howard asked for the favor. I hope it'll turn out to be okay. Well, it didn't. And somebody else had to direct a lot of the action scenes. As a matter of fact, the stunt supervisor, a man named Paul Stater, a hell of a good stunt man, and I worked out almost all these action routines. And the director just sat in the background, because he didn't know what to do about this kind of stuff, And we were just about finished with the film, and I was having some still photos shot, and the phone rang, and the photographer came hurrying back. Cornel, Howard Hughes wants to see. So he was calling from Vegas, and said, Cornel, I just wanted to tell you, you were right about that damn director, and hung up.
Can I just finally ask you, Mr. Wilde, about this sort of, let's cover, if we can, just in these 10 minutes, the last few years, where you directed as well as acted. Now, with Robert Redford winning the award on Saturday, it's not such a fantastic thing now for actors to direct. Now, when you started, it was a bit more, wasn't it?
It was very difficult, because hardly anybody who was an actor was directing himself. And I was told time and again that it's impossible, an actor can't direct himself. And I would point out that people in the theater, I think Sir Beerbohm Tree for one, and Olivier directed themselves successfully. And I was a writer when I was an actor in New York. I sold options on 2 plays, which was terrific for just the financial thing, getting that option money in one lump. I sold one to the Theater Guild. They didn't do it, but at least, it's nice to even have them take an option. And then George Abbott, who was the biggest of all the comedy and musical comedy producers and directors on Broadway, took an option on a comedy book that I wrote for a musical. And so I always wanted to direct. And I was asked to do General Electric on the Air half-hour show, to star in it with my wife, Jean Wallace. We've been separated for, I guess 2-3 years, and we're finally getting a divorce, but that was then. And we were both to be in it. It was a story called The Blonde Dog, from a prize-winning short story. And we read the short story. It was very good. And I called Alan Miller, who was head of that division of Universal MCA at the time, and said yes, like it. No script arrived, week after week. So finally I called him. He said, Cornel, the trouble is we got a bad script, and I'm afraid if you read it, it'll turn you off, and I don't want you to not do it. And I said, well, just let me read it, Alan, and I'll see, maybe I'll have some suggestions. So he sent it to me, and I had a lot of suggestions. And I went out to see him and the producer, and started telling him, what I thought would be good for it and bring it up to date and so on. And I was about 15 minutes in. He said, for Christ's sake, that's terrific. He said, let's get a stenographer in and you can dictate the script. And I said, Alan, I can't do that, but I'll take it home and write it out. So I did, and I very carefully wrote a half-hour teleplay with every shot carefully lined out. And they liked it very much, and were delighted. They were out of the problem. And I said, well, there's one thing, Alan, I wrote this, you like it, I'd like to direct it. He said, oh, come on, Cornel, you can't direct yourself, and, your wife's going to be in it, you'll have to be more careful and whatever. I said, well, Alan, if you read it, every camera shot is there. It's the way I'll shoot it. Finally, I convinced him, and we had 2 days rehearsal and 3 days shooting, and it turned out to be one of their best of the season, and we got very good reviews, and they played it a lot. So now I had film, and I read a book that I liked, and I went to United Artists. Max Youngstein was head of production then, not here, and I knew him well, and I gave him the book, and I said, Max, I'd like to do this, as an independent production. And he said, I'll read it. So he read it quickly, called me, and said, yeah, I like it. Let's get together. So same thing again. I said, I want to direct it. And same thing again. Oh, come on, Cornel, you can't direct yourself, and so on. And I said, well, I'd like to show you a half-hour film that I did for General Electric. I showed it to him, and he said, if you did that, and 2 days rehearsal, 3 days shooting, he said, I'll back you. So that was my first feature film. And that got very good reviews, and then it was easier with each one. And I continued to write and produce and direct. You see, all the years I was an actor at 20th, I was often bored out of my mind on the 20th and Columbia and wherever. Sit around for hours while they do things and putter around with this and that. And I never understood why all that time had to be wasted. And aside from that, I had my own ideas of how I would do this, how I would do that. And having gotten the start with I didn't write the script. I got a very good writer, Horton Foote. He used to write for Playhouse 90 to do the screenplay. And I've been doing it ever since. And I must say I've been lucky, because out of 9 films that I've been involved with in independent production, 5 are moneymakers, and that's surprisingly enough, that's a very good ratio.
How would United Artists fit into the picture? I mean, United Artists was very important, weren't they, as far as people like yourself or people with independent projects going concerned? I mean, they were quite a milestone in Hollywood history.
Wonderful. Because they did what none of the others wanted to do and tried very hard to prevent from being done, to give the artists a piece of the profit, and to have an actor or writer or director or whatever be completely in control. And that was wonderful, because the usual thing was you'd work for a studio, produce, direct, or whatever, and somebody would be overseeing everything that was shot, and every day you'd get notes of criticism about this or that and the other, and you had to explain, well, this will be okay because there it fits into this and that and other. You wear yourself out, explaining everything. And it was great with UA, because I just go and make the picture, and I didn't even have to show them footage until I had a rough cut. And that's terrific to be able to work that way. And
how did they finance it? I mean, when you went with the project, I mean, did you have to put up some money yourself?
No, they put up the financing. You generally have to take some of your salary in deferment form. In other words, if the picture makes a profit, you get your deferment. If not, well, you end up with short money for all the work you do. I did 3 films with UA, and it's it's a great system. UA says very clearly that it is not a producer, it's a distributor. And therefore, legally, they cannot tell you how to shoot the picture. Or at the end of it, when you have finished, then as the distributor, they can say, well, this is too long, and that will people won't like this or whatever, and you go to preview and see if they're right or not. And generally, I found them very helpful in some of the things they pointed out. I mean, Mike Medavoy, for one, and Max. It's a great way to do it.
Do you think independence has gone too far now the other way? Are we now sort of...
Of course, whichever way you want to go. Under the old system, it was the studio head who had complete control of whatever he wanted to do, and sometimes that went too far because he'd get carried away with his own greatness and making the biggest picture ever, and, you know, it could turn out to be Cleopatra, which was, you know, one of Zanuck's mistakes. Well, nowadays, with the strength of the independents, the successful independents can really do almost anything they want. They get $15 million to do a big film, and then all of a sudden, 2/3 of the way through, they realize that it's far from finished, and the distributor or the studio has to put up more money and more money and more money, and finally they've got a huge budget on a film, which still has to have a huge advertising budget, in fact a bigger one, in order to help recover the budget overages. And you know, that kind of runaway thing, which you know, does happen. Because people who are heavily involved with the creative effort sometimes lose perspective. You know, they want everything in the picture, and they're so close to the story, which perhaps they wrote, that they don't see its flaws, and then as the shooting goes on, more and more things are changed or replaced, and it goes on and on and on.
Would you have rather have started off today than with the period you did?
Oh, of course. I mean, it would have been infinitely better for me because by nature, today's way of doing things is very right for me. I really relish the independence, and I work very hard at trying to make things as good as I think they can be done, and I've often let my withheld money, you know, go into the movie rather than start cutting back because I know I'm going to lose some of my salary if the picture doesn't make profit. I mean, I can't think about that. I just want it to be right and as good as it can. I've taken a lot of physical chances, you know. Pictures like Naked Prey and Shark's Treasure, that's part of the investment too. I mean, if you risk your life in a picture, you know, yeah, that's part of it because it's an independent film. It's your film.
Films are very physical, aren't they? Your independent films. I've always noticed that. Well, have you got a sort of and there's always an outdoor feel to all your pictures. You seem to, so you want to get away from that studio. You know, want to get outside.
You're very right. I like being outdoors anyway. I don't like shooting interiors nearly as much. Although, I mean, that's exciting too if you have wonderful interior scenes to do. But you can't match the outdoors. I mean, God, the most marvelous sets are there for you, infinite in their grandeur. And, you know, to be able to use that is just terrific. And the other thing is that you know, what makes a story go, a dramatic story, is conflict. And the stronger and inevitable the conflict, the more exciting it is. I mean, if two people are at odds about something that makes them enemies, either one of them can say, oh, the hell with it. But if it entails life or death for one or the other, that's as far as you can go in conflict. So I like stories that have that kind of thing, where people's lives are on the line, or even the existence of the world in No Blade of Grass. That was from a British novel.
Very good book, I read that. It's just called Death of Grass.
Death of Grass, right. And I thought it was a marvelous novel that was over at MGM for years. They bought it. I didn't. I read it in 1956 when I was working in England in picture. And I just thought, gee, I've got to have it. And I found out MGM owned it. Over the years, they did nothing with it, and I kept calling and asking if they'd sell it, and no. And they had 5 scripts by very expensive writers on it. And finally, they changed management, not management, but, you know, production head again, and then Herb Solow, very nice, intelligent man, came in. And I wrote out a treatment as I would do it, bringing it up to date, you know, from 1956 to 1970, 71, there's a big difference. And I was, by then, well hooked on ecology and all the problems because of pollution and mismanagement of resources and everything else, and I felt I could use this, or not use this, but use the ecological approach as the springboard for all the disaster that happens, world famine and so on. And I really believed it, and I still do. And there have been examples of it, where there were local disasters, and you know, but for grace of God, there could have been much, much bigger ones. In 1970, when I was shooting the picture, a corn fungus hit the corn crop in the U.S., which, of course, goes to so many countries and is a big staple for feeding livestock and everything else. And in some states that grow corn, it had killed off 50% of the crop. And they feared, in fact, Nixon had a meeting with many scientists, I read, about what to do if the next summer were to be hot and humid, like that one, because that weather condition spreads the spores. And just like in the book, there was a line in the book that the spores of the fungus, or I changed it to virus, are carried by the wind, and it was denied by the British government, and it was denied by the Nixon administration.
Too much denied, I think.
In summer, yeah. And in November, I read an item from Mississippi that the spores were carried by the wind, and that just burning the field, as in the book, did not cure the problem. It was interesting.